Marcus 咧係嚟自加州嘅。
And I grew up in Mexico. I heard there's a sister from Colombia here.
今日冇放書所以咁咧Marcus 咧佢喺墨西哥長大嘅，咁就當然係講墨西哥話。
When I was 4 years old,
西班牙話啦。
When I was 4 years old, my family moved to Mexico to plant churches, and so I lived in Mexico for 9 years, and then moved back to California.
當 Marcus 3歲嘅時候咧，佢就同屋企人咧一齊去咗墨西哥咧，因為佢父母咧就喺墨西哥嗰度建堂啊，咁然後住咗9年之後咧就翻美國。
And then I always knew that I wanted to do mission work, and I thought that I would go to Mexico one day or to South America because I speak the language and because I grew up in that culture.
咁咧Marcus 咧一路咧都覺得自己咧會係做傳教士嘅，特別咧就會去南美啦或者去墨西哥，因為咧佢明明就係識得講嗰啲語言，又喺嗰度長大啊嘛。
And then one day I met a man and he told me about the amazing things that God is doing in China, and he told me that there is a huge number of people who have never heard about God and that they are very open to listening. They are very curious, if nothing else.
然後咧有一日咧，佢就遇到一位弟兄啦。咁嗰位弟兄咧就話俾佢聽，喺中國內地咧係有好多人咧對福音咧都好有興趣啦，亦都好願意去聽嘅。
And so after I graduated from college, I moved to Hubei, and I taught at Changjiang Daxue for a year and a half.
跟住 Marcus 咧就大學畢業之後就去咗湖北，跟住去學普通話嘅。
Along with my brother, and we
去湖北教書。
And we did evangelism there, and in a year and a half there were more than 80 people who were baptized. And after we left, 3 of the brothers planted 5 more churches in that town. And
咁喺湖北用1年半嘅時間啦，咁就帶領咗有80人去受浸喎。當中咧有3個人咧，佢哋另外咧就建立咗5間教會。
And so it was just amazing for us to see how God worked in that year and a half, because I was only 21 years old, 22 I guess, 22, and my brother was 23, and then we decided to stay in China long term, and so we moved to Beijing and studied Mandarin.
見到咧神咧即係喺短短1年半咧就有咁大嘅作為啦，咁於是Marcus覺得佢就想長留喺中國內地嘅。咁其實佢嗰陣時都係22歲，跟住佢咧就去咗北京嗰度學普通話。
And so in Beijing we work with 3 different couples, three married couples, and planted 3 different churches. And one of the church that my wife and I planted a year and a half later, Adam. I see there's 7 pictures of Adam. Adam came and he supported us in our ministry and worked with some of the single men especially, and so he is our co-worker there in Beijing.
咁喺北京咧，Marcus 就同3對夫婦啦，咁分別咧都建立咗3個教會嘅。另外，咁佢同佢太太咧，咁建立咗教會年半之後咧，咁Adam 咧就去北京啦，咁佢就同Adam 一齊咧都係有同工嘅。
And now I live in Shanghai. I graduated. I finished my master's at Peking University in psychology, and I moved to Shanghai because all of my family was in Shanghai this year. My mom, my dad, my brother and sister-in-law, my sister, they all moved to Shanghai for 1 year, so I'm teaching at Fudan University right now.
Marcus 咧，佢而家就去咗上海嗰度住啦，因為佢咧佢父母或者佢阿哥嫂嗰啲全部都喺晒上海喎，咁佢而家咧就喺復旦大學嗰度教書。
And so my wife and I just 2 days ago celebrated our 4th year anniversary.
咁佢同佢太太咧就啱啱慶祝咧4週年結婚紀念。
But what I want to tell you about today is a testimony about my son. His name is Caleb.
今日咧Marcus 想同我哋分享咧有關佢個仔 Caleb 嘅事嘅。
It's like Jala from the Bible, in the Old Testament. Caleb. Oh. Remember when they said anyway? In Mandarin is Jala.
Jala.
Okay, yeah. Jala. Yeah. And so he was born on October 29th of 2010.
咁佢個仔咧就喺上年嘅10月29號出世啦。
And the second day after he was born, I was in the hospital with my wife. She was recovering, and he just turned gray. His face looked gray. His feet and his hands were purple, and it looked very, very scary.
咁當佢出世嘅第2日咧，阿 Marcus 同佢太太即係喺醫院嘅時候，就見到佢個仔 Caleb 塊面咧灰色啊，啲手腳咧就變咗紫色喎。
And so the nurses rushed him down, but this was in the middle of the night. The nurses rushed him down to the ICU, and the doctors there were too inexperienced, and so they said, we want to send him to the Fudan儿童医院, to send him to the best children's hospital in Shanghai, and but it's more than an hour away, and they said, I don't think that he will live on the ambulance ride. Maybe he will not be able to survive.
咁當時咧，醫院咧嘅醫生咧就覺得係好冇經驗，唔夠經驗去處理呢件事啊！佢哋就算咧放咗佢喺深切治療部咧，都係覺得不如最好就係即刻咧就送佢去復旦嘅兒童醫院啦，即係一個當地嘅比較好啲嘅醫院啦。咁但係咧就個旅程咧就係要成個鐘嘅，咁而啲醫生就覺得我恐防咧你嘅仔仔係唔能夠即係捱到去嗰個醫院嘅。
And once he got to the hospital, the doctor said, we're not sure if he's going to live because we're not sure what's wrong.
咁去到嗰個醫院咧，醫生咧就話唔知道佢可唔可以活過嚟嘅，因為我哋唔知道發生咗咩事佢咁樣嘅。
He was having seizures and
佢抽筋啦，
and he wasn't breathing.
佢個仔抽筋啦，唞氣唔係唞得好好啦。
And finally, after the next day, they found out that he had very low blood sugar.
然後咧第2日咧，醫生咧就發現佢個仔咧係好低嘅個血糖。
And so they gave him glucose, and they gave him steroids, and they gave him medicine to stop his seizures.
咁咧就譬如幫佢吊鹽水啊，又俾佢即係俾一啲藥物佢去阻止佢繼續抽筋啊咁樣。
And he stayed in the hospital for a month.
然後佢個仔咧留院咧留咗1個月。
And they ran many tests to try to find out what was wrong.
咁就進行咗唔同嘅測試，即係檢查睇下係咩事咯。
And they didn't know. And every time they tried to stop his glucose, he would start to have seizures again, and he would start to go unconscious too.
咁每一佢哋都唔知道係咩事啦，但係每一次如果唔俾糖分佢個仔咧，咁就會抽筋啦，同埋咧甚至會陷入昏迷嘅。
And then probably the most difficult part was when the doctors told us that he had brain injuries because of low blood sugar, that his brain had holes in his brain because of not enough sugar.
醫生咧就講到話第2個問題就係佢個仔因為唔夠血糖啦，所以佢個腦有個窿。
Just brain damage.
即係佢個腦咧受到損壞。
And then a few weeks later, the doctors told us that he was blind because they did some vision tests.
然後咧過咗幾個星期之後咧，醫生甚至就話做咗一啲檢查之後咧，發覺佢個仔係睇唔到嘢喎。
And sorry, I don't talk about this very often, so it's hard. And then about a week later, the doctor said there's nothing more we can do for him in China because the Fudan University Hospital is the best in Shanghai, and it is one of the best in all of Asia. And they said, we have run all the tests we can, and we have no idea what's wrong, and there's nothing more we can do here.
1個星期之後咧，醫生咧就同佢講就話基本上咧喺中國內地咧都冇咩可以幫佢個仔去做噶啦，因為佢哋住嗰個醫院咧已經係其中一個最好嘅醫院啦。咁喺中國內地真係咯，冇咩可以做啦。
And during this process, there were thousands of people praying for Caleb.
喺呢個過程當中咧，有上千個弟兄姊妹咧係為咗 Caleb 去祈禱嘅。
Which was very important because after a few weeks, I stopped praying.
因為其實呢一樣係好重要嘅，即係有咁多人去為佢個仔祈禱係好重要。因為件事發生咗幾個星期之後咧，Marcus 咧停止咗祈禱。
So we wanted to send him to the United States, and the hospital said it was going to cost $200,000 to have a jet to take him to the States. 20萬。咁於是咧佢哋就決定即係想將 Caleb 咧就送去美國嗰度醫啦。咁但係如果要包機要有專機去美國嘅話咧，就要20萬。 And obviously we don't have $200,000.
咁當然啦，我哋冇20萬啦。
but then 3 days later, the insurance company called and they said that they are going to pay for it all.
咁啊，但係咧，保險公司幾日之後就打俾佢哋話啊，佢哋會負責個費用嘅。
So they sent a plane all the way from the United States with 2 doctors and 3 pilots, and they came. It's just a very small plane, and they came to Shanghai, picked up my son, and took him back to Los Angeles.
咁於是咧就有包機咧由美國啦，裏邊由美國嚟嘅，裏邊有2個醫生、3個機師啦，咁就嚟到上海接佢嘅仔，跟住就送去美國。
And it was the best children's hospital on the west coast of the United States.
然後就去到西岸咧最好嘅一間兒童醫院。
And he had 5 teams of doctors. He had neurologists and endocrinologists and geneticists and nutritionists and just general peds. He had about 20 different doctors that were working on his case. They were trying to find out what was wrong with him.
去到美國之後咧，咁嗰個醫院咧有5隊嘅醫生啦，大概20幾個專業嘅醫生咧，就係喺唔同嘅範疇咧，就係去照顧佢嘅仔嘅。
And they didn't know, and he was still not doing well. And finally, another very low point is when the doctor said that they think he has a very, very rare genetic disorder called GLUT1, which is, they said in the whole world there are only 100 people with this disorder.
然後咧，佢哋醫生咧就有一個推論啦，就係佢個仔咧就係患咗一個極度罕見嘅一啲關於基因或者遺傳嘅好罕見嘅遺傳病啦。
And the only treatment for this
可能全世界得100個人定全美國得100個人有呢個病。
And they said the only treatment for this disorder is to have what's called a ketogenic diet, which means you have to eat 90% of your diet has to be fat. And then 10% can be sugar, carbohydrates and anything else, but 90% just has to be fat, like butter or like lard.
然後咧，醫生咧就話有一個建議嘅治療方法嘅，就係之後佢個仔嘅即係飲食咧都係超過90%咧都要係脂肪嚟嘅，其剩翻嗰1成咧先至係碳水化合物啊或者係糖啊咁樣嗰啲其他嘢。
And if they don't have that diet, their brain will incur more and more brain damage every day until eventually their brain disappears. It just is eaten away.
如果唔係咁樣食咧，咁佢個仔咧嗰個腦咧就會一日一日咁樣自己會冇咗咯，咁樣即係一定要咁樣飲食嘅。
It is such an awful diet that they have to use tubes to feed the children because no one will want to eat such a horrible diet. So they have to put the food directly into their stomach with a tube to feed these children.
如果要咁樣進食嘅話，因為冇人係願意去食嗰個餐裏邊超過90%都係脂肪嚟嘅，咁所以咧就要用一條管啦，去將嗰啲嘢啦入落去個胃嗰度啦。
And like I said, many people were praying all around the world for my son.
咁當時咧有好多人去為到呢件事祈禱嘅。
My family would send out emails to say to pray for Caleb, and they would be forwarded to churches, and then forwarded to other churches, and forwarded to other churches. And many times we received our own email from people we never knew, people we had never even heard of. They were forwarding us an email telling us that we need to pray for Caleb. And it was the email that I wrote maybe a week ago or 2 weeks ago.
咁就不斷咧去邀請其他人去禱告啦，咁用電郵嘅方式，咁啲人咧就將啲電郵咧再去傳開去，就再去傳開去，咁所以咧 Marcus 有陣時候會收到一啲 email 咧係一啲佢完全唔識嘅人，但係佢哋咧就話會去為到 Caleb 去祈禱嘅。
And then one day the doctors in Los Angeles decided that he does not have that horrible disorder.
咁突然間咧有一日咧，醫生就話唔係冇嗰個病。
And then a week later, they stopped his glucose, and he was fine. They stopped giving him.
然後咧就唔再去再去幫佢去維持嗰個血糖咧，咁佢個仔又冇事喎，即係冇抽筋喎。
And then a week later, the doctor said, "You really need to go home. There's nothing wrong with your son."
咁然後過咗1個星期之後，醫生就話：你哋可以翻屋企喎，你個仔冇事喎。